to be as fun and festive as we can, and hopefully all of the founders on the phone can join us with that as well. But maybe I'll just kind of start off by asking, first of all, where you're dialing in from and how your week has been so far.
I'm in the Seattle area at home I've spent way too much time here, as most of us have, but my week's been pretty good, all things considered. My kids got their first COVID vaccine. I have a 5 and an 8, almost 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so that's like a huge relief step forward in life. So I feel that has made my whole week feel good.
That's amazing. I never thought that we'd get to a point in time where we're super excited about injecting our children with vaccines, but
right.
So happy to hear that your kids have been vaccinated. That's awesome. So maybe we'll just jump on into things. I have a few questions here, and we'll leave some time at the end because I'm sure a lot of the founders on the phone have some specific questions for you as well. I think when we start thinking about go-to-market strategies specifically for early stage founders, we also see this challenge at the growth stage. I mean, a bit of context on Georgian. We are a growth stage venture fund. We invest in B2B SaaS companies who typically have at least 6 million in annual recurring revenue and are doing some cool things around AI, machine learning, and trust. But we experience this challenge as well, where founders tend to be very, very focused on product market fit, and then how to sell that product, and executing on go-to-market strategy tends to be an afterthought. So I'm curious to get your point of view on when in the journey as a founder does go-to-market strategy really become relevant?
I think it's a good question. I think what you're saying is it rings true from the companies I've advised, invested in, or been part of, that a lot of times it's an afterthought. You sort of bolt on your go-to-market strategy, right? You have this idea of an innovation or problem, but I think that it works so much better if you have it infused in your initial concept, even when you're just kind of building the castle in your head of what the company is going to be. And I love the Drucker quote that, business has only 2 functions, innovation and marketing. Because I think that really does ring true. If the whole purpose is to create a customer, right, that's where all the results are, from the innovation and the marketing. And I think what most people miss early on is that you need really good fit between those activities to get a competitive advantage and get the kind of growth that probably all of you want if you're trying to build venture scale businesses. So I think if you can put it in really early and think about it as whether you like the Michael Porter, fit, mutually reinforcing activities thing, or you like the Jim Collins flywheel, however you like to think about it, but these are 2 pieces that really work together. And I think that it's fundamental to what kind of company you're going to build is to have your go-to-market in mind when you're thinking about the innovation or the problem that you want to solve. Now, you don't probably have all the tactics and channels figured out, but at least some vision about how the pieces fit together and reinforce each other, I think can be super helpful.
Yeah, no, I totally agreed. And I think another, challenge for some of these early stage founders as well is you tend to take go-to-market on your back, as well as, building a product and trying to find product market fit early on. And oftentimes we see founders really be the number 1 salesperson, in addition to building a team and working on product strategy and trying to raise capital. So I guess a follow-on question for you is, when did you start thinking about bifurcating your go-to-market, responsibilities and strategies? And when is the right time to bring in that first go-to-market hire? And who should that first go-to-market hire be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the composition of the founding team and where the strengths and weaknesses are, and just being honest about those things. So I've been privileged to work with great technical co-founders in every company. And I wore the hat of the first marketer, the first salesperson, running all the go-to-market early on. I definitely played a role in product and was, doing product strategy and vision and some PMing, but probably 80% of my time across my companies has been early stage on go-to-market, whether that's discovery with customers or actually going out and selling the thing once you feel like you have some fit. So I think if you can bring in a founder to do it, that's, I think, the ultimate scenario where you can kind of have another person that's really in the core team that can drive it. But if not, I think you can bring that sort of almost founder person pretty early to start, taking up some of the things that are maybe your weaknesses. Like if you aren't good at sales, then that might be a logical place to start, is to have a salesperson. If you're not so comfortable tweeting and, speaking and doing podcasts and like getting the message out, then, possibly a marketer. But I think it really starts with looking at the founding team and being really honest about like where your strengths and weaknesses are and where you're going to have fun. Yeah. So that's how I think about it.
That's awesome. And sorry, I'm kind of going off the moderation guide here, but you mentioned a great point about how fortunate you were to have amazing technical co-founders, which is really important. And I think we see this challenge usually with technical founders who don't have, a supporting partner that has been focused on go-to-market. And I, curious if we have any technical founders here who are looking for a partner, but say, you want to maintain founding control of the company, and you can't really pay an additional partner to come on and focus on go-to-market because you haven't raised your first round of funding. How would you think about that challenge?
I've done it for free. So, I think there's other people like me who like have the wherewithal to know if you can get like the CTO job is the hardest one, I think, or if you're the technical leader in the early stage, I think is the hardest one because, like if the thing goes down, you aren't allowed to sleep. Right. And there's so many things like that fall on the technical founders' shoulders, right? Like you have to ship this thing, but also be customer centric and engaged with the market and recruit the engineers who are making $500,000 and you're going to pay them nothing. Like it's so hard. So I think like there are people out there who recognize that, as their go-to-market people, they recognize that, having a great technical co-founder is the ultimate key that they need, and they'd be willing to make that sacrifice. If you can't find somebody who's willing to make that sacrifice, I mean, honestly, my advice would be to keep looking harder. I know that's kind of sucks, but I think people are out there who will make that sacrifice at the founding stage. And then if not, I think then you're sort of trying to unbundle it, right? You're sort of take that person and unbundle it and sort of pick the capabilities that you want, right? It's not necessarily a role. I think what you're looking for is skills. Like if you need to build brand, then you want like a brand builder. If you need to do direct sales, you want somebody who has done sales or done outbound. So that's probably how I think about it, is like first, try really hard to bring somebody who's equity motivated purely early. And then if not, it's kind of unbundling the skills so you can make it affordable and sort of piece it in.
Awesome. I'll go back to the script now. So I'm curious to hear, your biggest learnings as a third-time founder yourself on the importance of having the right go-to-market strategy in place. And if you've made any mistakes around maybe not having the right go-to-market strategy in place, what were those pitfalls and how did you kind of pivot or overcome them?
Yeah. I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where it needs to fit. Like the best go-to-market, your product creates some leverage. So that could be like what Zillow had in the early days, where their data basically made it easy to produce content and get PR because they had this amazing data set that was powering their product, but it could also power great content marketing and PR, and they could slice that data up by geography and go pitch all these individual news outlets in each geography. And so that's like one way to create leverage. Product-led growth with like a free offering or like a usage-based or metered API kind of thing that then brings people into the paid product is another way to do it. But I think that's always been where things sort of fail, is like if you're just trying to bolt it on. If you're just like, we built this great thing and now we just need to go pound outbound or pound SEM or pound paid social, it like you're always in a race to the bottom on that, versus, where you can actually create leverage from like the core product or the core like thing that you're bringing into the world. I think that's where I've gone wrong myself, and where I see a lot of others go wrong.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, the product-led growth story is always an amazing approach to starting off a go-to-market strategy, because the product in essence sells itself. But then you can get into certain go-to-market challenges around almost having the wrong customer in place. And then that starts to hinder things like your retention metrics over time, because you might be acquiring amazing customers, but maybe you need to fine tune your go-to-market strategy to actually be acquiring the right customers. How do you think about that challenge, especially early on as companies are really just trying to onboard customers so you can prove you have product market fit and then find your first investor?
Yeah, it's so hard because you don't know, right? Like you're making this hypothesis about who your ideal customer is, but you don't exactly know. And so I think like the quicker you can iterate on that, the better. And I think, it goes to positioning too. Like I think if you're really focused on your positioning early, like then who your customer is kind of falls out of that. And so I think a lot of people ignore or don't do the basic positioning exercise, like the for who, we are this, which is different than alternatives because, like the traditional like Jeffrey Moore positioning grid kind of thing, even just something that simple can be really clarifying, and then constantly like coming back and updating that. So I always advise founders to really bring positioning in really, really early and try to get clear and just know that you're probably not 100% right, but continuously kind of update that view because everything else seems to sort of build off of positioning and go to market. At least that's my point of view. I think if you get it right, you get huge leverage because you're pointing your resources like in the right areas and you're telling the right story, and like all the other content and campaigns that you build sort of feed back to that. And if you're way off or don't have clarity on positioning, then you don't know what you're building on top of.
Yeah. Totally agreed. And I actually was right about to ask this question, and then Divya posted it in the chat because you mentioned when you get your positioning right, it's kind of this beautiful thing and all the puzzle pieces come together. But how do you know that you have the right go-to-market strategy in place, and how does that evolve as your company starts to scale?
God, I wish I had the perfect answer to this. It's so much gray area with all this stuff, right? And I think it's so much of it is managing your own psychology and sort of stepping back from those days when you're just like discouraged because you don't think you have fit. And then the days where, some customer says yes, and you think you're about to be a $10 billion company. And like, you're going through that hour by hour. So I think the only way to know is in conversations with customers. I mean, ideally a transaction or some commercial, signal is the best thing, like if they're paying or they're signing. But I think if you're before that, then it's sort of, are they leaning in, their body language, like what kind of look and feel are you getting when you're talking to people and when you're presenting it to people? Because I think you have to just try to get as much of that signal as you can. And that's the only thing I found that tells the truth. The roller coaster struggle is real, somebody said, which is, it so is. It so is.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, Georgian, we focus on growth stage companies. And at that time, once you have a certain amount of revenue scale, you can really see that you have the right go-to-market in your specific metrics. Like you can see it in your CAC payback period is below 12 months. Your retention is super high. I'm speaking specifically about software companies. If you don't have a software company, I apologize. But your retention metrics are really high. Customers are upselling and buying, whether it be new product lines or thinking about seat selection. And that doesn't, ring as true for early stage founders because you might not have a revenue to be tracking these types of metrics. So aside from, some of those customer specific metrics you just commented on, body language, et cetera, what would be some metrics that you'd start tracking as an early stage founder around go-to-market execution if you, didn't have, meaningful revenue at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start to, it depends, right? If you're B2C or B2B and how long your sales cycle is, but I'd start to break down the buying journey in a little more detail. Like if there's some point where you get that revenue validation, like what are the logical steps before that? That could be that they sign up for your design partner program. And so like, what's the conversion rate from conversation to becoming a design partner? And you can kind of look at that by type of customer persona too, to help you know if like your ICP is right or if your message is right. So that's how I would probably start to think about it, is just like, are you moving people along toward your ultimate goal of revenue? If you're doing some sort of a beta or early access, if you have a freemium motion or like a PLG motion, then yeah, are you getting people into the free product experience? And then what do those cohorts look like in terms of their usage and engagement? I think can also be really telling. Like, are they adopting, or are they just like signing up and then going away a week or two later?
Awesome.
Yeah. Cause what you're trying to get, at least in SaaS, right? You're trying to you want like net revenue retention ultimately. Like you want sticky customers that are really engaged and that are going to grow. And so, but you don't like you're saying for a growth stage, you'll have these cohorts that are really mature. But when your oldest cohort is like 2 months old, you have no idea. So I think I would just start to look at the stage gates before that, and maybe pick 1 or 2 that you're going to really focus on, so you don't drive yourself crazy.
Awesome. And so I guess, how did you think about developing your go-to-market strategy differently across the various companies that you founded or, previously led go-to-market teams at?
Yeah. So, but I've done 2 companies that really grew or that were long runs, Simply Measured and SiftRock, and they were very different businesses. So at Simply Measured, everything we did was kind of by accident. I don't know that we had a master plan. I mean, I'll be the first to admit that. But ultimately, what the early go-to-market looked like was we had a free product where you could generate a free report. It was an analytics product. And that was really instrumental. So that was like one channel that worked. And then our product, because it was analytics, we could collect data on all these things happening in public in social media. And we would create infographics and we would send those to the media outlets that our customers were reading. So that was another place that like our product was creating go-to-market for us. It of course took some human work to take the data out, package it up, make the charts, pitch the media, but we ran those 2 motions and we didn't do much else. So we just ran those 2 motions. We brought people into demos and then we did demos. We didn't try to like go much broader than that in the early stage because we found that those things were working. With SiftRock, my next business, it was totally different. We were 100% bootstrapped. So what we did there was we entirely attached ourselves to one of the platforms we integrated with, which was Marketo. So we just niched down our target very, very carefully. And so then we did paid on LinkedIn and we kind of did events and we did outreach within that community in like a very, very laser focused way, where we just said, we're only going to take our effort toward people who use Marketo because we think that's our strongest integration and our strongest user base. And we had kind of discovered that through some early customers. So they were different, but I think the common theme was that it was about focus, like finding 1 or 2 motions that worked and then just like doubling, tripling down on those until either we had more resources to expand or they started to kind of run out.
That's awesome. And we actually had a great follow-up question in the chat here on this one about how many iterations of those motions did you go through and how quickly did you find out that they were working? It sounds like in your first company, it was a beautiful accident. And in your second company, it was much more targeted. So it'd be great to hear the difference in, how quickly you realized that your go-to-market strategy was working.
Yeah. In the first one, it was a beautiful accident. And then we just like followed where the signals were. I don't know how many iterations it took, but it felt like a lot. Like, especially the message. We didn't know exactly what the message was or what the product was. That took a lot of iteration. The free thing, I think we were pretty committed to it, but the exact packaging and how and like where we limited it, it took a lot of iteration. And ultimately it got down to this. We had a free report that you would tweet in order to get. So we had kind of like an interesting mechanic there as a social media company. Very, very Web 2.0, very of the times in 2010. With another company with SiftRock, I think it took us probably like 3 or 4 months of just going broad before we realized that we needed to focus on one like marketplace, just one integration. So we just did a bunch of meetings, a bunch of like outbound, and kind of after it wasn't really working, we were like, okay, we need to focus down even more than we are. And that's when we kind of found the Marketo hook.
Awesome. And I just want to continue to encourage people to post questions in the chat. I apologize to S because I'm kind of going all over the place with the script here. And as questions come and they fit in, we'll just kind of talk through them. So if you do have questions, please post them in the chat. If not, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. But I'd love to kind of shift here and talk about how founders should think about their go-to-market strategy when it comes to raising capital and starting to communicate with investors. So what level of detail should early stage founders have on their go-to-market strategy when starting to initiate conversations with potentially their first investor?
Well, you would know a lot about this too, Madison, so I want to hear your take. My view is in the early stage, it's more about the positioning and the broad strokes than about particular channels and tactics. Like maybe you have one motion that's working and you can kind of wave your arms a bit that you're going to have all these others that light up and are magical. But I think if you have your positioning clear, like who your customer is and how you're different and what category you're in, that's probably where I would start. Like the seed pitches that I see, the ones that have that more clear, they do stand out. The ones that like aren't quite sure who their customer is or what their differentiators are, that's a little harder of a sale. And then like, yeah, as you have a business, then you get your unit economics and it really shifts to being about how do we put $1 in and get $2 out. But in the early stage, I think you're more about like, what market are we even going after?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, I think once it shifts to kind of growth stage and you have some type of measurable revenue, or you can actually measure unit economics, that's definitely a portion of it. But we focus a lot more on how, well, that's table stakes. We really focus a lot more about go-to-market team construction and what your processes look like. We dive into things like the handoff between your marketing channels to sales and what those conversion ratios look like across your go-to-market funnel. We double click on things like upsell and how many products you have to extract even more revenue and create a longer partnership with your underlying customer base. And a huge focus for us is around expansion. What are your go-to-market expansion opportunities? Is it potentially through channel partnerships? Is it potentially starting a new sales channel? Let's say you're primarily self-serve. Would it be helpful to have a direct sales team? Are you mostly inbound versus outbound? And how do you switch to maybe having a more inbound focus? We think about things like geographical expansion and how that could impact your go-to-market strategy. And it becomes a lot more about, we can look at your historical metrics and we can benchmark those against everyone is looking at the same unit economic benchmarks, but what is really the upside? And do you have a clear plan on how you're going to execute? Every management team thinks they're going to get to 100 million in revenue, but do you have a clear plan on the various go-to-market channels that get you to that 100 million in revenue? Do you have the team to get there? And then ultimately, do you have an underlying customer base or a product that is sticky enough to enable you to grow into that 100 million of revenue? So it becomes much more metrics driven, but then in addition to that, we start to think a lot more about your go-to-market team construction and the various expansion opportunities as well. Adam, I don't know if you have any additional commentary as your business is scaled to different rounds, and then with Drift, it would be interesting to think about as you were preparing for an exit, how did they diligence your go-to-market strategy, and if they had any feedback for you during that process?
Yeah, I mean, they looked at a lot of things that you were mentioning, and then also just sort of trying to model, since we were another SKU that they sold to the base, like what would that look like and how would that drive their business? So yeah, from an M&A point of view, I think like people are going to really look at that. I think you're right too, like the handoffs and the nuances of your kind of go-to-market engine. And I think the nice thing about now versus 10, 12 years ago when we started doing SaaS is like these playbooks are pretty well understood now, and you can go out there and learn from others. Like you don't have to invent a lot of that stuff. Like what's an SDR, what's an AE, what's a good quota, how should the handoff work, right? How much ARR should a CSM manage? Like all those things are pretty well understood if you do your research and talk to others. Like you can pretty much run the playbook that is common, at least in a SaaS business.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other part that I probably missed is the ability for the management teams or go-to-market teams to truly be able to articulate differentiation, like where you play and how you win and why you win. I don't think that level of articulation changes throughout your journey. As you were mentioning, Adam, as an early stage founder talking to investors, having it pretty figured out, you might not have the revenue to back it, but having your at least strategy and idea pretty figured out is really important. But then as you scale into the growth stage, like really being able to deeply articulate how you're differentiated, why that matters, why that enables you to continue winning. is probably another caveat that I throw in there.
Yeah, I'm very biased. Like, I think that stuff is everything. And I also think that a lot of founders make the mistake of trying to create a new framework to answer those questions. And you don't need to, because people like Jeffrey Moore and people like Michael Porter have spent like decades trying to figure that out. And there's so many good resources. Like if you read April Dunford's Obviously Awesome, or you read Trout and Reese on like positioning, there's just so many good frameworks that you can just pick up off the shelf and use to help you and your leadership team answer those like key strategic questions. So I think a lot of people thrash on trying to like build their own framework, but you don't have to do that. You have to answer the questions, which is the hard part, but there's a lot out there that can make that easier.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned a lot about, really understanding and knowing your customer and how that can really help you answer some of these critical questions. And you've mentioned that in your own interviews, that in past roles, you try to talk to your customers every single day. So I'd love to learn a bit more about why this is important, and how some founders watching can incorporate customer feedback and customer communication into their priorities, because you guys are so busy. But how did you think about prioritizing that?
It's hard because all the pull is inside the building, right? Like, it's the meetings, it's the interviews that you have to do, it's the investors, like all that stuff is inside your company, right? But all the answers and all the value gets created outside your company, right? Like the whole point of your business is to create a customer. And so if you have to just force yourself to do it, like I like to think of two logical extremes, like a CEO who all they do is they're out engaging with the market and then bringing insights back into the company to drive strategy, versus a CEO who's just internally focused. And it's like, well, for me personally, and the way I operate, I'd much rather be the market, the one that's out in the market. And so just try to like keep that on the schedule, protect time, make that part of how I operate, and then make sure the team is doing the same. But it's really hard because you're just constantly getting pulled away from it. But your point of view becomes stale if you're not continually like talking to people. And I actually had that happen where I just got sucked way in for months, years, and my point of view just got outdated, and I missed things that were critical for what the company needed to do.
Awesome. We have a related question to that in the chat here, about momentum gathering around low-cost social ads to test and understand early messaging and positioning. How effective do you think that is, and how is that changing with new platforms and shifting algorithms?
I think it can work it depends on your business, right? Like if you're selling 100K ACV enterprise software, like you probably need to go look at that VP of whatever on a Zoom and see how they react. You're just not going to get enough data points, getting clicks to a landing page, and you're not going to like get anything conclusive. I think if you have more of a, volume and velocity kind of business, then it totally makes sense. I think a lot of people do that. But I think what happens is you can over-engineer it, right? And you're trying to set up this perfect experiment and get the ad and the landing page and the form and, do all this. But sometimes that just takes more time and effort and is less conclusive than picking up the phone 10 times. So I think that's the only caution I would have, versus just like getting out there and talking to people. On my podcast, I've interviewed a lot of founders, and even in some of these consumer businesses, a lot of times they like went to Starbucks and interviewed people, or, went to the mall, like Matt Oppenheimer at Remitly. They like went and set up a thing at South Center Mall and like had people use their app and they talked to them. So I think being pretty scrappy is usually the default, but I do think you can get a lot of good insight from doing little experiments with paid social.
Awesome. And you mentioned, a few frameworks earlier, I think in the previous question that we were speaking to, but it would be great to kind of double click on some of these go-to-market frameworks and recommendations, and how to think about which channels these founders should use. As you mentioned, you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. There are various frameworks out there. So how do you think about those frameworks, and a double click on those recommendations, I think would be very helpful.
Most of the frameworks I know are like positioning and strategy frameworks. Like the playing to win, the guy from Procter & Gamble, is it Yeah, playing to win. I get that confused with play bigger because it's like too much play and sports analogies, which kind of suck. But it's playing to win is kind of the, what's your winning aspiration? Where do you play? How do you win? I think really helps. Jeffrey Moore has the little like classic positioning framework, the four, actually I have it right here. It's the for who our product is, unlike, I don't know if you've seen that, but if you Google like Jeffrey Moore positioning, it'll come up. I think Andy Raskin's framework for strategic narrative is really, really good if you want to tell a why now story, which he starts with like the undeniable shift. You create stakes, right? That's if you're trying to create a movement or you're trying to ride a big trend. Those are a few that I go to a lot. I like April Dunford's obviously awesome as well. She sort of wraps together a lot of these things into like a really clear, just positioning document you can create. So those are some of the frameworks that I like. With channels, my thought on the channel, I tell founders this, and I don't know if this is just my opinion, so take it for what it's worth. But I say that you need to find the channels that you love and that you want to spend time in as a founder, because ultimately, like a lot of the early marketing tends to be the founders. So if you hate Twitter, like you probably shouldn't use Twitter. If you hate podcasting, don't start a podcast. Like if you don't listen to tons of podcasts, don't start a podcast, right? If you don't like events, don't make events the centerpiece of your early strategy. Once you hire a team and you can have people go, do those things. But I always tell people, like, try to find the channels where your customer is, but also where you're really comfortable and where naturally you want to spend time.
Got it. Amazing. And I think when you have spoken about positioning, a lot of it kind of comes down to understanding your ideal customer profile. For an early stage founder, can you maybe walk us through some of the steps you've taken to first understand that critical piece and align that to your positioning strategy?
It's another one of these things that there's no shortcut other than just talking to people, right? And like making a hypothesis, then doing interviews and seeing if they're the right fit. And I hate saying it because it just sucks. It's so hard. It's so hard to be like making calls and reaching out cold to people all the time to validate these like hypotheses that you have. But I have never found any shortcut or silver bullet that works other than that. And then eventually like patterns emerge and they reveal themselves to you. Like, I can't exactly tell you how we figured out this, like, for SiftRock, like our ICP was Marketo users in these size companies. And once we got that, it just unlocked everything because it made every like growth thing we were doing more efficient and focused. And then it unlocked our message because we knew specifically the psychology of those people and how it was different than the broader market. So I think it's just you like keep pounding the pavement and eventually it reveals itself to you.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'd really love to, double click on messaging. When did your messaging strategy really come together at your previous companies? And how did you ensure your messaging was aligning with customer problems to demonstrate the value that the product could bring?
That's a very good question. I think it's just always a work in progress because I remember our early messaging and it always happened after 3 or 4 months, it would just feel wrong or I hated it. And, and it would feel amazing like when we first kind of had it, but then it would very quickly sort of get stale or need to be refreshed or need to be tuned. So I think the main thing is just to commit to the process of like, okay, this is the version that we're going with. And we're going to update it based on like what we learn and continuing to talk to our market. And we're going to update it regularly because I think a lot of people, what they do is they get stuck and they don't take a message, right? They don't take a position. I think this is actually a big mistake people make. Like they're too safe, right? So they they don't take an edge. Like you need to have an edge. You need to say things that people are thinking, but they're too afraid to say out loud. And you need to go give them the language for that. And so I think you're better off to try taking an edge and then iterate when it doesn't work than to be too safe or take too long or too consensus driven in how you do your message. I know that's not exactly the question you asked, but I do think it's more of a like process unlocks a lot more of it than, some like magical way to do messaging.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you use, you mentioned how important it is to just kind of try these things and iterate. And did you leverage, a customer advisory board to, test some of these ideas you had, or how did you go about testing your messaging?
So I've never done a true customer advisory board, but I've always just tried to talk with the early customers a lot. And then the other thing, like I've been pretty big on creating content and social media and like Twitter for my first company, LinkedIn for my next one. And I think that's another good thing is like, you can see how people react. Like when you're putting your ideas out there, like what's getting engagement, what's getting comments, like, and you're not giving your pitch, but you're sort of talking around your idea, right? Or you're talking around the shift that you see or the problem that you see. And then you're seeing like what parts of it and what framing grabs people and pulls them in. I found that to be really, really valuable because you can do that frequently and there's like no cost to it other than just like the risk of embarrassment.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure there are many risks of embarrassment when you're taking an edge or taking a stance on something. And Pamela asked a great question in the chat for you, an example of how to take an edge. And it would be great to kind of hear a personal example of yours on that one.
Sure. I mean, the classic one that I think of is Salesforce, no software, right? Like there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can name an enemy. You can say something that's a little bit controversial. You can throw something else or an old way, new way. You can put the old way of doing it, kind of throw it under the bus. At Drift, we had a big thing, no forms, which wasn't actually true. Like we did not replace forms. But we got you to think about like how forms suck and how, like chatbots are a good parallel path for your visitors on your website. So I think like trying to, come up with stuff like that. That would be probably my best examples.
Got it. Awesome. I have two more personal questions for you. And then I'd love to flip it to the group to see if anyone has any questions they haven't thrown in the chat. The first one is, I think, a pain point we hear ever so often, especially when early stage founders don't have funding yet. But if you don't have funding for paid marketing, and you think that outbound is really the only way to attract a meaningful customer base, what are some creative ideas you've had around that challenge?
Okay, so no funding, and we've determined that outbound is the right channel.
Yeah,
that's a tough combination right there. I mean, I think there's a lot you can do in LinkedIn now, right? Just direct outreach. If you really have zero money, like you can't buy tools, you can't scrape, you can't do anything to like semi-automate this. That's tough. Like, I think you need a little bit, like at least a few $100s to get a few tools, like to get Sales Navigator or get, Lusha and get some contact data. There are, I think if you can get focused enough and you could get a list and you could get like a reply IO or an outreach or a mix max kind of tool, like setting up an outbound sequence that, where you're doing token replaces instead of actually putting your hands on the keyboard every time to personalize is maybe like one way to do it. But you have to really like get your list very, very tight to make that work. Because otherwise it just looks like spray and pray. So I think outbound is one that's a little bit hard to hack, but if you get your targets tight enough, then you can get there.
Got it. And then how does SEO come into play now? If we move from paid to some organic search, when did you start thinking about your SEO strategy?
I've never had to think about an SEO strategy for my businesses, and that might be a little bit unique. I've always been of the mindset that like content, community, audience building, brand, like those are where the leverage is. And I've never scaled the company to the point where I had to get super serious about SEO, because the farthest I've built is to like 20 million on my own. And like Drift, we had SEO and we had SEO people, but I've never been part of a B2B company where SEO was like the top channel or the key to growth, right? Like it was always just like, yeah, we'll hire one person to do that when we get to that size, or two people to do that, and like make sure we optimize our blog posts. But I always thought that in the earlier stages, the leverage was in, like community content that builds audience, building your own channels, that kind of stuff.
Awesome. I do have a question on community, but I know we only have 2 minutes here. So I wanted to flip it to the founders to see if anyone had any questions. I mean, feel free to come off mute and strike up a conversation.
Hi, this is Sirisha, Madison and Adam. Lovely discussion. I really appreciate every part of it, that you've been talking. It resonates so much with me. I'm a deep tech founder and I've been into this journey the last 3 to 5 years. And then I started a company which is into sweat wearable technology, and we are developing wearable devices for tracking glucose and other key electrolytes. And I'm exactly going through the process of convincing the first set of pilot customers. We are still pre-revenue. I mean, we are surviving on fundraise. I mean, I'm coming all the way from Sweden, and I'm currently based in Seattle, Adam. I'm in Savannah. The reason I'm here is because we have begun the first pilot studies with Mayo Clinic, but then it's not as easy as we thought when we were back home. There's so many things that we have to put together to convince the customer. So my question to you guys, Adam and Madison, is like, initially the idea was to find a bunch of customers, scale and scale and scale, and then probably think of an exit. But the idea now, I mean, we literally pivoted from a typical medtech company to a consumer wearable tech company because of all the things that we are seeing and the practical issues around making this a medical device, taking it through FDA, the funding that it needs, all the time that it takes. So we said, like, let's try to go behind the lowest hanging fruits. So we have identified a bunch of sports and exercise physiology companies, some biomarker research, university hospitals who are all interested in getting the first set of devices and then doing the paid pilots with us. But then, yeah, I mean, every day it's a learning. We begun, and then there's a new learning. There is a sensor that needs to be designed in such a way. Maybe there's too much of sweat. Maybe there's too little chemistry. All these things we are trying to figure out day by day. And it's, yeah, great journey though. But my question to you guys is like, somebody like, a founder like me who's at a stage like this with limited funding. I wouldn't say that, there's no funding out there. I mean, I've been really lucky enough, we've seed funded. We did a combination of seed funding and angel investment and close to $1 million USD back home, and, with all the nice investors and everybody out there. But then, yes, this journey would still require, ample amount of funding. And I'm really, really looking forward to making an exit with the first set of, happy customers. I mean, would you recommend somebody like me to do that? Or would you say, like, hold on to this journey and then make it a $100 million company and then think of an exit? I mean, what would be the right thing to do?
Well, I think the problem is that when you're thinking of an exit, you don't get an exit. Like when you're trying to build a big company or you're trying to build an enduring company, that's when the acquirers get interested, because then that sort of proves that you have something that's worth buying. At least if you want to get bought, not sold. Like there's definitely companies that get sold, but you definitely want to be bought. So I think that would be like, probably your default is to think more long-term about your business and then sort of keep your options open in terms of an exit. It sounds to me like your go-to-market requires a lot of capital, not knowing a lot about your space, but it just sounds like that's very complex. There's channels, there's consumers, there's lots of different constituents, and it seems like it would take, and you're doing hardware, right? So it sounds to me like that's like expensive to validate that you can get distribution. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful riff, but those are my reactions.
Yeah, thank you. I think, yes, I mean, hardware is difficult. Like every investor, we're trying to approach would say like, oh yeah, SaaS is my space. I mean, they would put in hardware, receive, blah, blah, blah. But then when we send them an email, I mean, that's the kind of response. I mean, that's totally acceptable. I mean, no hard feelings around it. But yes, I mean, I think we are going with a proper strategy. I mean, we have identified a bunch of first set of customers who are all into biomarker research, who are all into exercise and sports physiology, who would need these kind of biomarkers. Somebody, might be wanting to test their glucose, lactate, or other electrolytes. And Sweat is actually giving us a range of biomarkers that we can, tap into. So that way, I think, strategically, being part of accelerator programs, the last one was Sony and We did a couple of other accelerator programs, and they all kind of groomed us in a direction where we could get the first strategic partners. We have about 10 of them. Now, the challenge is to convince all 10 of them. So at least, we will have the first set of paying customers for some amount of paid pilots, through a out licensing and then some kind of subscription. So this is exactly what we're doing. I think, if I were to talk about these things 2 years ago, then I would say like, oh God, how would I do this? But now I think we did, some good things. We did, gather pretty good amount of interest in terms of letter of intents, in terms of commitments for paid pilots. But then the thought is like, is this could be an easier way to, present ourselves in front of a big wearable tech company, and then see what happens. That's the sort of mindset which I wanted to bring it forward. But yeah, I think it helps. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We have one more from Trista, and I'll ask it. How do you see product market fit fitting into go-to-market strategy? I'm currently trying to get a PMF and then come with a go-to-market strategy, but should they happen in parallel?
I think I'm curious your take on this, Madison. I think the things that do happen in parallel come back to positioning. Sorry to like keep beating the drum on that, but it's like, who are you for? What category are you in? What market do you serve? Like some of those questions that are sort of the anchor of your positioning will happen in you'll be iterating on those questions and answers while you're getting product market fit. But the other parts of your go-to-market strategy, like what channels are you going to use and how are you going to scale those channels, and like what are the unit economics going to be, and what's your handoff from marketing to sales is going to look like, I think those usually come later, like after you've gotten some customer success with your first 5, 10, whatever paying customers.
Yeah, I think my short answer is my opinion is you need product market fit in order to actually start executing on a go-to-market strategy that will endure. If you don't have product market fit, like I mentioned, you might start getting your first few customers through the door, but you're not going to retain them. You're not going to upsell them, and it'll be challenging to maintain that relationship over time, and then actually build a go-to-market engine that is almost self-sustaining. So I totally agree. I think you'll start to answer some of those initial questions about where you play and your differentiation, and start to build a positioning strategy, but it would be challenging to, hire up a sales team if you don't have product market fit. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam and Madison, so much for this really engaging conversation. I hope you all got some great information from them as well. And we'll be sure to also, Adam and Madison, if there's any information you would like to continue to give our founders, we'll be sure to add that to a follow-up email to everyone. But I'm going to let you all go. Thank you so much. To all of our attending founders, thank you so much for joining us for this half day of events, networking and content, and we really appreciate you all for joining us and hanging out with us, listening to great music and engaging with our partners. I would like to one more time give a kind of shout out and thank you to our partners over at Zendesk, Georgian, Silicon Valley Bank, and Cooley, and also Davis and Dixon as well. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, there will be a follow-up email with more resources. We will be providing replays of the 2 content sessions as well. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to give you back the rest of your day. So have a good day, everyone. Have a good week.